So, hi, I'm Tulani Bridgewater from The Wolfer, and I want to welcome everyone who is joining us today on The Wolfer Live. I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming author memoirist Lacy Crawford, who is going to speak with us today about her novel that recently came out on Little Brown, and it is called Notes on a Silencing. Here is a copy of it here. I really encourage every single one of you to get a copy of it. It is one of the most compelling things that I have read in years. So I'm not going to uh, do anything more than pass this on to Lacy, and then we're going to have a conversation and we'll see where it takes us. But I'm going to let her introduce herself. So to you.
Thank you, Talani. I want to give a short bio that I think is the most accurate bio, which is that I'm a mom. I'm 45 and a half and counting every day. And I wrote this memoir, Notes on a Silencing, after having spent a life in and around writing and publishing, writing a lot of fiction that I wasn't successful with. One novel that is on the shelves that was out 7 years ago, a satire of the college admissions process, which had grown out of a sort of side hustle that I had through graduate school and thereafter working with high school seniors on their college essays. What I was doing, without telling myself I was doing it, was trying to help people late adolescents tell the most true thing about themselves and what they wanted. Because, of course, the story I was unable to tell was the most true thing that had happened in my life when I was 15, 16, 17 years old. That story is the story of a sexual assault that I suffered when I was 15 years old and a student at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire. I was a boarding school student. I grew up privileged, but it was nothing like what I saw when I arrived at this elite institution, or elite is in quotation marks for me. It's a very self-preening school. There's a lot about it that's remarkable and a lot about it that is based more in myth than in reality. Um, and I was effectively silenced, and we can go into the details of how that happened. But the school got way out ahead of what had been done to me, which was a statutory felonious sexual assault. It was very straightforward. And they made it go away. They magicked away the problem of me and my assault. And they did that at an enormous cost to me. I had decided by the time I was 40 and married finally, after so many false starts and therapy and moving and trying again and again and again, I had finally put all of this behind me, I thought. But in 2017, the state of New Hampshire opened a state investigation into St. Paul's School because there had been so many stories of assault on campus that had come forward, most particularly that of Chessie Prout, which rose to national prominence in the media. She had a book out about her experience. She was raped as a freshman, sexually assaulted as a freshman by a senior, Owen Labrie, who subsequently served 12 months in prison for his for his crimes. I joined that state investigation into the school very, very privately. Once I did that and started working with detectives, they were interviewing my parents and some other people. Somehow the school found out that I was a part of this investigation, and their lawyers contacted me and said they wanted to hear from me, at my earliest convenience. And I thought, yeah, I bet you do, and forwarded that to Concord Police. And that began something sort of out of a crime novel, really, where they raced up to the campus and they got a hold of my student file, which, even though it was 25 years old, that afternoon just happened to be sitting there on the rector's desk. And inside my file was documentary evidence of the way the school had silenced me 25 years before, when I was 15, 16 years old. And it was devastating and also incredibly validating to hear that they had found these things, that I hadn't been wrong. And this, I think, every survivor of any form of assault that I've ever talked to, there is some tiny clawing part of her that thinks it was somehow her fault, that it was something that she had done, or if only she had done it differently. And to be shown actually in black and white in documents that exist outside of your own reality that no, they did this to you, was so, it gave me the authority over my life in a way that I had never had. And then Concord Police tried to introduce this information to the state investigation, and they were quashed. They were severed from my case. They were told that my file would not be included in any way. And effectively, I was being silenced again. And I thought, you did it once when I was 16, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let you do this again. At this age, absolutely not. Not after Me Too, not in the world we're in now, not for my kids or your kids or anyone else's kids. So that is a very long-winded way of getting to why I wrote this book, which has just come out last week.
So the thing that I mentioned to you before we started the interview was that your book had a tremendous effect on me personally. And I suspect that many readers, women in particular, will also relate very profoundly to this. And I think that a lot of the feedback I understand you got from publishers when you were shopping this book, both is ironic because you were consistently told that, as they termed it, rape stories were basically a dime a dozen, which speaks volumes about our culture, and it speaks volumes about how women's assaults and rapes are treated. It also was yet another layer of taking away your voice and not allowing you to speak truth to what had happened to you. So the fact that the book came out at all, and particularly I think in light of the fact that there were so many people that did not want this book to come out, is a triumph unto itself. But the way that you wrote this book, I think, is also incredibly admirable, because you managed to take something that, by all accounts, is, could be presented in any variety of ways, but you created a narrative that is true around it. Of course, it's from your perspective, but I think with all of the corroborating evidence surrounding it, no one's going to ever dispute the facts of what happened. They can try, but that's all part of a manipulation. But you also managed to introduce qualities to this that I think differentiate it from a standard memoir. So it has the narrative tone of a Gothic sort of novel. You have crime, mystery, tension in here. You have the heartbreaking story of yourself, who at a younger age you managed to sort of separate from in a way that I think is very deft, but it also speaks to how many survivors of assault have to deal with the things that happen to them, which is that you open the book, and so this isn't giving anything away, but you open the book detailing the events of the night of your assault, and they're told in the third person, which I found incredibly moving, because you are distanced from yourself in that moment, and then it reverts into the first person, but bringing yourself all the way from that age forward. And so we kind of experience the growth of your experience with this assault in a very real way. And so I want to ask you, how did you come to, how do you tell the story that has really impacted your life at every level, cellular all the way up to, the macro, in a way that is both true and artful and compelling, the way that you did with this book? I couldn't do it.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think you should try before you decide that. But thank you. But for a very long time, I couldn't. And there's a lot in what you just said about sort of how the sausage gets made that I think is actually important, because it is not just about books. Books are a particular market, but it is illustrative of how difficult it is, I think, for our voices to be heard. So I tried to write about this forever. I started trying to write about this when I was in college in a seminar with Toni Morrison. And then I didn't know what to do with it. And then I actually dropped out of a PhD program to try to write it in fictionalized form. Again, I didn't know what I was doing. It wasn't a very good novel, but there were people who believed in it. They sent it to a very prominent agent. And this is the line I think you're thinking of. I had an op-ed in the New York Times that was born of this experience. And this very, very prominent agent called me 2 days later, and she said, yeah, your characters are great, and there's some nice descriptive language, but, date rape stories are a dime a dozen. Now, there were a lot of reasons why she didn't pick up my novel. I don't want to, make it seem that that was the only reason, but that line has really stuck with me because, first of all, it wasn't a date rape. I was assaulted by 2 men at my school, but we weren't on a date. And also, what is date? What the hell is that? There's rape. I think in the moment of violation, the point is that you as a person cease to exist to whoever your violator is. And I really don't know at that particular moment that anybody is still on a date. I think at that point we have encountered a different space. And I was so it just clawed at me and clawed at me, this line. And so when I got to the point now in my life, a couple years ago when I was writing notes on a silencing, I realized that the market, and this is so awful, but the market had shifted, right? I mean, we do listen now to women's stories. Me Too, Tarana Burke has given us the opportunity to consider that everybody's story taken en masse actually matters, because this happens all the time. So my assault was not very interesting. There's really nothing very unique about it, nothing unique about it at all. However, it took place on the grounds of an elite institution, and to be really crass, that sells. You know, I mean, St. Paul's School sneezes and the Boston Globe covers it, right? And I had documentation, I had medical records. Also, there's the fact that I contracted a sexually transmitted disease very, very deep in my throat as a result of this assault. That turned out to be the clinical evidence that my pediatrician had. She referred to it as the smoking gun. So these are things that are, I mean, this is so awful, but they're clickable. Do you see what I mean? So if you are a survivor who is being silenced again, and you think you're going to explode because you have to get your voice out, what do? Do you go to the police? Well, I'd already done that, you know, and they'd been severed. Do I sue? So my husband and I talked about that, but why? What for? You know, we hire a lawyer and we, you know, I don't know. It's just, or you try to tell your story, but even so, what it takes to be heard in the marketplace is not about what we've suffered, but rather about what is interesting and marketable about the dimensions of what was done to us, right? So one of the reasons I wrote this book the way I did is because I wanted to dispense with the assault right away. I don't think it's special. And I also needed to tell it in the cleanest possible way I could, because I think the greater violation for me by far was the way my school treated me and the way that community handled it. That is what took me apart as a young person, not the violation of my body. That I survived and could have sustained, but it was what followed. And that for me is the heart of the story. So I needed to get the assault out of the way, very much the way it happened to me, which is as though it was happening to another girl, because what the hell is this? You know, I didn't know that could happen to a person. I didn't know until it happened to me. And even then I had no words for it.
What I found really also very interesting is that, you know, you refer to words, you were very, very careful in your language. And you were very fair and balanced in your language, which I think is part of what I found so very appealing. And there's a tendency, particularly now, for the volume to get cranked all the way up, and things get very inflammatory and they get very dramatized. And that seems very actively not the case in this book. And it's almost the quasi-banality of everything that is so jarring. And the precision of how you describe yourself. You went into great pains to distinguish that it was an assault. You didn't feel entitled to use the word rape. You didn't feel that rape necessarily applied. It's an examination of, you know, the body and the self. And it's also, you know, an incredible examination of how privilege and how wealth and how exclusionary culture factors into all of this. And so, you know, here are your parents who, you know, worked in, you know, their field was theology, you know, so, you know, you come from this very structured environment where really there's a kind of duality of thought. There's good, there's bad, there's right, there's wrong. And you kind of got mired in that as a young person, because in order to accept the thing that happened to you, you had to accept some form of complicity, or, you know, devalue your perspective in order to make it fit. So can you talk a little bit about those elements? You touched on the privilege part, and I think that, you know, the school itself, yes, but it's also everything that supports the school, because it's a dream. And like you say, so much of it is fiction, you know, and I went to a very kind of storied academic institution, and I found the same thing. A lot of it, frankly, is a lie, but it's a very well-constructed lie. And it's a lie that everyone has to participate in and be complicit in. And in order to maintain the future that you envision for yourself, you have to sacrifice yourself to supporting that lie. And that was explicitly demanded of you in order for you to return to school, but it plays out in so many other ways.
I think that's right. And I think it's not unique to educational institutions. I mean, what is particularly galling for me about a place like St. Paul's is that it's a place that traditionally has had networks that expand into lots of areas of American leadership. So, politics and the arts, and certainly industry, certainly finance. That is changing as the country is changing, although not fast enough. But when you get to a place like this, you learn, as I did, that there are people who belong there because they were born into the right family. It has nothing to do with what kind of student they are, or what they're capable of, or how they approach their classwork or their peers. It's simply because that is how their family is. And for everybody else, you're a brave pretender. But if you get through, then you're one of those, right? And then you join this network. And I think it's like, a lot of alumni networks sort of make hay of the same fantasy, right? So what you mustn't ever do is show weakness. What you mustn't ever do is show a sign that you aren't meant to be here, right? So if anything goes wrong, you better hold on to that. And that is, I think that I know that to be the case in so many other organizations. We've seen this in athletic organizations. We've seen this in the military. We've certainly seen this in churches, and in shuls and other religious communities, where being a part of it requires you to assume full agency that if anything goes wrong, and otherwise to offer yourself up. And that doubles down on a kind of internalized complicity that I, as a girl, had. I don't know if every girl had it. I hope not. But I've sort of reflected on this so much. The two men who assaulted me were captains of their sports teams. Of course they were. And they had very prominent girlfriends, and their relationships were the ones everybody knew who they were when they walked down the halls. One of them was a foot taller than I was. I'm 5'7". The guy was huge, right? And somehow, after they did what they did, I was like, that must have been my fault. Right. As though they were marionettes, and I somehow got, and why on earth did I assume agency over what these physically enormous, to me, utterly uncontrolled men chose to do? And yet I did. And I was like, right, I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to make sure nobody ever finds out. I'm just going to get through. And I couldn't. And one of the first reasons I couldn't is because they bragged. They bragged as soon as they could about what had happened. So, and how many of us have had that experience, right? And nobody said, you did what to her? Instead, everybody said, she did what to you? And if that's how the community experiences it, who was I to argue, right? I was 15.
Well, and I think that this also goes into a bit of the issues surrounding why feminism and how it's been kind of co-opted and contorted and misinterpreted is so important, because as young women, we are given the mixed messaging that we have no control, and yet we are fully responsible. And so when you're a young person and you're still, at 15, we're still children. Our brains are still forming. Yes. And I think as a parent, and you're a parent as well, we see that very acutely. So the notion that you did something to two men who are older than you, who the law recognizes as grown men, who are also physically larger than you, and at that point in your academic career, far more successful, prominent, known, etc., than you were. Oh, yeah. The notion that you did something to them or were somehow complicit in what they did to you is, offensive, but I think it also speaks to misogyny. So on top of all of that.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. But I owned that first, right? I was the first person to silence me, the very first one. And it is because I believed that there was no one who would support me, who would believe me. And you know what? I was right. What I discovered when I finally spoke up and told my mom a few months later is that I was right. Yeah.
So one of the viewers has asked, first of all, she says, you're so courageous, which I think is both true. And I think that anyone who's gone through something like this, there often comes a point where you have no choice.
That's right. Yeah.
So I'm sure that you felt that at various junctures. But she also wanted to know, how do you protect yourself as you retell your story? How do you not re-traumatize yourself?
Right. Think how lucky I got, though, seeing the documents I saw. Mm-hmm. Right. So it was a gift. And I don't speak in terms like that very frequently, but once I saw this document in my student file. It was actually read to me by Concord Police, the lawyer's plan for silencing me. I got a hold of my medical records, which should not still exist, frankly, but they did on microfiche, I suspect because there was a crime in them. And so they had been, saved. And I saw that the school had seen that I had contracted herpes in my throat when I was 15 and not told me. The doctor on campus didn't tell me, and they didn't tell my parents, and they didn't tell my doctors at home. So my doctors at home were saying, does she have leukemia? Because I'm bleeding in my throat, I'm losing weight, I can't eat. Does she have lupus? Does she have another autoimmune disorder? Get blood work, get this. And the doctors are just sitting there quietly, like, well, it's canker sores. I mean, it's, I saw what they did. And I was able to see also with the eyes of an adult. I mean, my oldest child is 10. When I was 15, I was pretty sure I was like almost done growing up. Like I definitely had the world figured out. But I look back now and I realize that a 15-year-old, I mean, I would not let them out of the house, like my own, I was such a child. And so I was given, what I want to say is that I was given a kind of authority that allowed me compassion for that girl. And as much as I have had therapy and read all the books on the courage to heal and read the feminists and followed the feminists and marched with the feminists, for whatever reason, I could not say to her, I love you. It was not your fault. I don't know why. But once I had those documents in hand as an adult, as a mom, I thought, girl, I'm here now. I am with you now, and we're going to do this together. So what had been traumatizing was the silencing of it. I did throw up after I wrote the assault scene, not the one that appears on the first page, but the one that appears in the course of the narrative where I actually go there, as it were. I did get sick. It happens, but I think as for being brave, so much of what I think people say about this is that it's brave to talk about a sexual assault. If I were writing about having been carjacked or mugged or in a plane incident or something, people would say, my gosh, that sounds so scary. Are you okay? But I don't think people would say, wow, you're so brave to talk about it. So we're assuming that there's a kind of residue of shame that somehow attaches to me. And part of the reason I wrote this book is to say, no, I will not carry that. That is not mine. The school should be ashamed. Those boys should be ashamed, but not me. I wrote a book. I mean, it's brave because like a lot of people know I slept with my ski instructor now. Like that's kind of a thing, like my parents read it. I think their faces must have melted off. But, but as far as the shame part, I'm done. I'm done with that.
Yeah. Well, I love that you're discussing the shame part because I think that is where everybody gets hung up. I know that that's where people like to place you.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that was really interesting is that the irony, because you go to great pains to not really demonize your assaulters, but it's clear that years and years later they're also carrying the weight of what they did. One is, by all accounts, still enraged and, feeling justified in that rage and in denial about it. And so, as much as we would like everyone to clearly be a monster, I think that part of this is also just exposing the structural support for monstrous behavior and the expectation, perhaps somewhere these boys misinterpreted what their role was and how their behavior was supposed to be. And they turned themselves into monsters. And then it was supported and reinforced. And so they go on with the burden of that as well, which doesn't often get discussed, but you managed to do that as well.
I think exactly, because to me, I think to say that people are monsters is a cop-out. It's the easy way out. There are a few, psychopaths out there and we know who they are, but like, they didn't kill me and eat me, right? I mean, it was very different. Like, so what I was trying to point to is exactly how a system like that both enables, as you say, and protects this kind of behavior. To me, I read the Weinstein headlines like we all do. He's a monster, he's a monster. Granted, how many people at the Weinstein Company and in his circle knew what was going on to some extent and didn't do anything about it? How many?
Yeah.
You know, how many? And that is what we need to be talking about, because it is one thing to start to speak of the perpetrators, to unmask them, to hold them accountable. Absolutely, that is critical work. But all of us sort of know who these guys are, don't we? I did, I mean, and the emails I've had since this book came out from schoolmates of mine saying, I know exactly who did this to you. And I'm so sorry that I never said anything about it. Now it's easier to do when you're nearing 50, but I've said to them, who told you? Where were you when you learned? And they say, I don't know. We just always knew. I just always knew. I just always knew. And I think we do always know, right? So the next step is, how do we reimagine how we're organized so that these things are no longer a permissible part of, cost of doing business?
Well, and I think, we're finding ourselves in a really interesting time, because here we are in a pandemic where, I mean, the economy is falling apart, the structure of our government's falling apart, the planet itself feels like it's falling apart. And so we're examining all the systems. And I think that as we're in the process of dealing with the political systems and the economic systems, and racial systems, this falls into that category. We basically have constructed a world unto ourselves that does not function. And this is a clear, example of that, I think, in your story, and how it does not serve any of us. And so I think that, your story, while the assault itself, as you say, is unremarkable, except that, of course, it is remarkable. It's remarkable to you and everyone who's in contact with you.
Right.
But this is one of those, this is like a pinpoint on a map that we can say, here's yet another example of how none of this serves us, and how do we correct this? And you've gone about the business of, fixing yourself, so to speak, so that you're fully functioning. You have a life, you have a family. One could argue that we're all broken in some way, but we break differently and in kind of interesting ways, hopefully. But you've turned out a piece of, basically, you've made art out of horror, right? One could say you have given truth to something that most people would prefer to be unspoken. And then you've survived and you've flourished as much as any of us can do. So you kind of have, in a small way, dismantled the system for yourself, right? And then as you're a parent, you're going to be vigilant about how the world functions for your children and the outcomes that they hopefully can avoid. But I'm wondering if, now that you've been locked down, and you have a book coming out in lockdown, which is so strange, so peculiar, and so we're doing these sorts of things, what are your thoughts on the larger repercussions for you and for, institutions and these sorts of situations? It's kind of a big question, and I'm asking a lot of you, but
No, there are a lot of ways into that. I mean, look, I grew up in a small town, and I was lucky and coddled and blind, and everyone in my world was white. And I went to a traditionally white boarding school that was founded for blue-blooded boys, and still basically for blue-blooded boys. And it wasn't until really, I mean, I was troubled by the kind of cruelty that I saw, but I did not yet have the words to understand that much of the cruelty I saw broke down on race and class lines. I did not see that or know how to speak to that when I was 14. By the time this happened to me, and I realized that what I had thought would be my path through this school, if I just studied hard and played my sports and sang in the choir, that all of that was being taken from me because of what these boys had done to me. That gap allowed me to start to look around and to realize, first of all, I expected this. I expected this just by virtue of who I am, right? And that was the beginning of a kind of awareness of systems and the problem of systems to begin with. So in terms of trying to rebuild myself, I mean, in truth, I married outside of the faith tradition, and some people would even say the race that I was raised in. My husband is the son of Iraqi Jewish refugees. We live in a different place. We're raising our children in a very different way. There are a lot of institutions that I am no longer affiliated with or a part of or interested in, frankly. That's about me. On a wider stage, it seems clear to me that my experience is a microcosmic example of how these institutions, which are supposed to be training up our leaders, Bob Mueller was there, right? I mean, have created instead a kind of impotence that at its best is very civil and very dignified, and at its worst is genocidal, frankly.
Right.
I mean, in truth. So it can look really pretty, when it's wearing topsiders and on a sailboat, but that's fortunately not the path that I took through it. So it's a complicated and to me very painful subject, and it is the beginning of a lifelong set of inquiries, obviously. But it is I'm hopeful that this is simply an example of how we are rotten to the core. If they're going to call themselves the center of things,
Right.
then I get to say that.
Yeah. And I think it could go so much deeper. Yes, rotten to the core definitely applies. And I think that we're going to have to recraft our expectations, our values, and our hopes and dreams in some way that is pivoting away from this, because it is. And I can relate because, like I said, I had a somewhat similar experience in a somewhat similar environment, but we're totally different people and in obvious and not obvious ways. But yeah, it just doesn't work anymore. And so hopefully with the lockdown and everything that's going on, we'll begin to move in a better direction. I don't know what that necessarily is per se, but I have one last question, which I think speaks to what we were speaking about before from one of our viewers, wanting to know if you encounter men or women in your circles who still don't get it, who still refuse to understand.
Yeah.
Seriously?
Oh yeah. Oh, for sure. Oh yeah. Uh, yes.
Terrible.
I there's a fair amount of this.
Mm-hmm.
There are people pretending that nothing has happened, so so they just missed, some press. It just didn't happen, and we talk as though everything is unchanged and nothing has happened in my life. And so it's, I guess, to me to say, gosh, I don't know if you saw, but I had a book come out, right? And I'm not gonna introduce that into conversation. That's painful and is an obligation to somebody else. And then there are people closer to me who are deeply disappointed in the choices that I made and who still feel that I have hurt their reputation. There are people very close to me who feel that way. And to them, I just keep saying that's why I wrote it, is because I hope that changes, because our children need to know that we believe them,
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. Well, I don't know. I think I'm supposed to ask you, we have like a Wolfer question, which is, now we find ourselves in our 40s, and which can mean a lot or cannot mean a lot. What does being in your 40s mean to you?
Oh gosh. Well, there's this book. It's kind of hard to see past this, right? But I didn't anticipate this. But I will say that I think I am a woman who wanted a family, and I had my last child when I was 40. So for which I don't recommend, but being for me, there is a pivot away from a time in my life when I wanted to be generative and fertile and creative in all of these ways that seemed rather traditional and nurturing in a very visceral way. And I feel my body literally shutting down and turning away from that in ways that at first I experienced as a little bit frightening, but now I embrace, because it seems like it's a gathering up and a redirection toward something that is much bigger and much deeper, which is to say, my investment in my community is unlike anything I've known. And my investment in other women is unlike anything I've known. And my children are fine. They're going to be fine. They don't, I'm done. I'm not, obviously, but I just think that the call is bigger. and my desire to respond to it is bigger, and I'm more tired. So I don't know that I'm going to be able to. But for me, it feels like finally showing up for all the people who showed up for me. And I didn't even recognize sometimes when they did, but I see them now.
That's really beautiful. I would say, from someone on the outside looking in and only knowing a very small sliver, I see someone who also belongs to themselves.
Oh, well.
Finally. So congratulations on that. Congratulations on this absolutely stunning book. I will never be the same. So thank you for the gift of that. I truly appreciate you taking the time to join us and to speak about this. We will continue talking about it. And, you know, we support you. We applaud you. We congratulate you. We celebrate you.
You can email me too. Anyone who wants to talk. I know how it is. So thank you. Stay well. Thank you so much.